Third.
You guys are starting there, right? And then
Oh, no,
We're live.
we're live, Gina. You kick it off.
great. So, good morning. I am Gina Moore, and I'm the Global Women's Rights Reporter for BuzzFeed. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, and this is the One and Women Thrive Google Hangout Teach a Woman to Fish. With me today are Ritu Sharma, the president and co-founder of Women Thrive Worldwide, Edith Jibunoh, the civil society advisor at the World Bank, Moletsane, a professor and the J.L. Dubé Chair in Rural Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and Barrett Ward, founder of FashionABLE, an accessories company that sources from women-led small business cooperatives in Ethiopia. Now we're here to talk about the role and the opportunities and the access of women to economies and economic empowerment worldwide. And we know, of course, that women face lots of barriers in the formal economies, and that informal economies that women have better access to are themselves full of volatility and risk, putting women in a precarious place globally. And all of us here, including our viewers, are probably familiar with these things. We're familiar with the idea that the barriers are about social and cultural norms because those get the most attention. But there are also other barriers like safety. Are there streetlights between your workplace and your home? Is it safe to walk home from work at night? Are there secure, well-lit toilets available nearby to where you have to do your labor? These kinds of simple things are also questions about women's access, women's opportunity, women's empowerment. We all know also that women are major, even if they're unrecognized players in informal economies. And we know that women worldwide do thousands and thousands and thousands of unrecognized, unpaid hours, even outside the informal economies. That's domestic labor, the home care work that pulls women away from wage employment and, ironically, makes communities and countries turn around. So with all of these things in mind, let's talk to our experts here about the achievements and the challenges for women's economic empowerment globally. And Ritu, we'll start with you. Right. What are the biggest challenges to participating in the economies that you've seen women face around the world?
Well, I could talk all day about that, but I won't. I think one helpful place to start is to think about which women are we talking about. So even in developing countries, women are not sort of a monolithic group of people. And at Women Thrive, what we try to do is really focus our advocacy and our work around women who live on less than $2 a day. So these are women who are very much in the invisible economy, the informal economy. They don't have wage jobs. They're not even working in factories or sweatshops. You know, that would be a step up from where they are now. These are women with very little education. They may have a lot of healthcare challenges. Many of them are rural, or they might be living in urban slums. So when we look at that population of women in particular, they really are shut out of the formal economy in a lot of ways. Some may be things as simple as there aren't really roads that go from their village to a town center or to a larger city where they can pick the things that they grow or that they make. It may be that they are not numerate, so they have a hard time negotiating around the price for their products, and they may often get cheated by middlemen. So there's lots and lots of ways that women in this population can be exploited. One of the things that I think we don't like to talk about a lot is that poverty is fundamentally a political issue. The women that are living in poverty, and men too, are populations that are rurally based. They may be ethnic minorities, they may be religious minorities, but these are groups of people that tend not to get as much attention from the national government, from the education system. They may not have water, sanitation, and electricity, again, because the development of these areas just isn't a high enough priority for the government. And so we're really glad to have one involved in this, because if we don't begin to think about women's poverty as a political issue, we're just going to keep on throwing family planning and microenterprise and entrepreneurship training at these women and not really address the fundamental issue that's really at stake.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some of the research that Women Thrive has done recently in Ghana and in Haiti that revealed, I understand, some bright spots, but also some challenges for women.
Yeah, so we spent about a year doing research on kind of women's status in the economy currently, and did a number of focus groups with grassroots people, women and men in Ghana and Haiti, to really spend some time understanding how they see these issues. How do they understand their economic problems? And one of the most interesting things came up, which was that they have some common ground with the big multinational corporations like Google, who also want to operate in these economies. And that is, basically the rule of law. Many of these women complained that they would make contracts with buyers or to the middlemen who kind of put the goods together, and they would often get cheated. Their contracts were not enforceable. They had no access to justice. They couldn't go to small claims court and take somebody and say, look, you've got to pay what you agreed to pay me. So these are similar issues that we do have even larger companies. Granted, Google has a lot more leverage than a woman who lives on less than $2 a day. But the problem is the same one. There aren't the structures there around that part of the economy where it functions competitively or it functions well. The other thing we heard from women in both countries was that working collectively was very important to them. When they came together in collectives or associations, they were able to get access to training or get access to bank loans or share the child care. They were able to begin to participate in the economy in a way that they couldn't do alone. So one of the things that we would like to see is not just kind of microenterprise or entrepreneurship training for women, but a whole package of support around women's economic opportunity, so they do have the opportunity to organize themselves. They have the money to travel to the town and come together and work as a group on some of the bigger issues that they face. So those were two interesting findings that we came back from Haiti and Ghana with.
That's really interesting. Thanks. Edith, maybe we can shift a little bit and talk about policy, the policy level of these challenges, perhaps with a specific focus on Africa. I wonder, what have you seen that has helped push women forward at a policy level, and what do you think is still missing from a policy perspective?
Sure. I really like talking about policy, especially because, like Ritu mentioned, this is such a political problem, and if we don't start looking at the policies that will actually address some of these barriers to women's economic participation, their rights to earn a livelihood, then we're not going to, sort this problem out. So some of the policy limitations, particularly, are, some of the areas that we've been looking at. And at the World Bank, we've costed some of these barriers, these discriminatory laws in countries to be as much as 1.5 to 2% of GDP. So for leaders, I think that's an important first step, because it needs to be recognized as an important issue for the economy as a whole, so that leaders are, incentivized to start taking the right steps to actually introduce policies that reduce the barriers that limit women from participating in the economy and earning a livelihood. So if you look at the data, you find that there's still about 128 countries around the world, so I mean, this is a big global problem. 128 countries that have limitations to women's participation, from things like getting an ID card or a birth certificate, really important things that can bring about financial security, because it limits their right, their access to land, or even getting a job. So these are really important things to start looking at. And then there are at least 28 countries that actually have legislation on their books that are discriminating against women. So I think looking at where there's an issue is one of the first important steps in costing it and introducing that to the leaders so that you actually involve the people in political power so that they can address some of these limitations is extremely important. But there has been some progress. I mean, I hate to start, like as a Debbie Downer, but there has been some progress. I think a lot of countries are, especially in Africa, are adopting, resolutions now that are addressing some of these issues. Peace and security is a particularly important area because many of the women who are stuck in this cycle of poverty are living in countries that are fragile or conflict afflicted. The peace and security legislations, and Resolution 1325 is a particularly popular one, is really important for affirming the rights of women, particularly in peace and security concerns. So I think African countries in particular have taken this a little bit further because they have been affected by conflict. I think in recent years they've had a lot of problems in this area, and and adopted recently an action plan which is being implemented between 2015 and 2020 to focus on gender mainstreaming to address some of these issues. But it's one thing to have these laws on the books and to introduce the action plans, the right policies. It's another thing to actually be implementing them. And that's where the majority of this challenge, I think, currently exists. And unless we start to look at what can be introduced in terms of data to assess progress and legislation that's actually specifying targets to assess the adoption of the specific things like how easy is it for someone to get an ID card or to get a birth certificate, we will not hit this, we will not finally tackle this challenge. So I think addressing some of those things is really important. The post-2015 agenda is an important opportunity for introducing some of these specific targets into the conversation, and one that I think many of us are engaged in, and hopefully we'll see outcomes that reflect the importance of these things. And I'll just mention one more thing before I stop. I also think it's important for us to be advocating for the legislation of political participation of women in countries, because that's another important area that offers a lot of potential for progress in getting women to access some of these rights. If you get the women actually in office writing the laws, then they're more likely to write in laws that benefit them. They're more likely to write in laws that address things like maternity leave. And in some countries, this is still a massive problem. In the US, not so much, but in many parts of the world, these things are still a major issue. You can get them to write in laws that actually legislate having male and female facilities when people need to use the restroom. So I think these are the kinds of things that we've been looking at and we think will be integral to making progress in this area.
You mentioned that one of the things that engaging on legislation really can do is put the people, the women themselves, in dialogue with or influential positions toward power. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you've seen local or grassroots women's groups wield their influence on government bodies, parliaments, legislative bodies, both maybe to pass some of these laws and also to hold governments accountable to promises that they make.
Well, I know one, well, I know of a few, but I'll mention one in particular that I was fascinated by. It's a Togolese organization called GF2D, and it's it's a French acronym, French phrase for the Women's Group for Democracy and Development. And it was a group of women lawyers that came together because they understood the Constitution, and they actually had the laws built into their Constitution. They just weren't being implemented because literacy is a problem in Togo. A lot of people could not read or interpret the laws or exercise their rights. So these women came together, they set up these centers, and they located the centers in markets that are primarily populated by women, run by women. And they would have paralegals. They would train these paralegals who would sit in these centers and receive women for free and explain to them what their rights were with regards to marriage, with regards to inheritance, when they were widowed, what the families of the deceased could and couldn't do to them. So this has become a really influential organization in Togo, and very, very impressed with what they've been doing. They also started training and empowering women to participate in politics. And I met one of the women who used to be a seamstress who was actually trained, and I mean, it was just unbelievable to see her gather in front of a group of market women, speaking in her language and telling these women what she was going to do for them as soon as she was in office. I mean, I was ready to vote for her. So there are local organizations that are really powerful, women's lobby groups, really powerful, and working at the grassroots level to make these kinds of changes. I mean, so I'll stop with that one mention, otherwise I'll get carried away and start listing.
That's great. Maybe we can shift gears a little bit. Lebo, I'd like to ask you, generally speaking, if you could kind of give us the perspective on the situation for women in South Africa, a country that's very often held up as a model of progress in terms of some progressive forms of legislation for women on the African continent, at least, and often globally. But you know, from the ground, from there, how does it look to you?
It was interesting to listen to Edith talk about the need for proper legislation and the need to put women in government, which South Africa has done very successfully, I think. The problem is that hasn't really made much of a difference for women on the ground. So what has happened in South Africa is that the policies have often benefited middle-class women, women who are educated, and the masses are still on the margins of this revolution, if you like. And so what is lacking, I think, is in terms of literacy, as she was just outlining, and in terms of women accessing and demanding their rights as is inscribed in our constitution. So skills is a huge problem for women, particularly in marginalized communities such as rural communities, informal settlement, and generally poor communities. So as much as there has been a lot of progress in terms of policy making, those issues still pose a problem. A second and related issue is also that of land ownership, particularly in the rural context. So in the absence of skills, for example, it would benefit women if they had access to land. But it is a fact that most women in rural areas do not own land and do not have access to land, and therefore cannot support their families. In that context also comes the issue of the three what I call the trio of factors, which is poverty, which is obviously linked to the fact that they don't own land, they don't access the economic environment, and linked to that, the socio-cultural norms, which often produce gender-based violence, crime, and safety issues for women. And linked to that also the issue of high rates of HIV infections, particularly among women aged between 15 and 45, which is supposed to be the most economically productive population. So those are a summary of the three challenges that face women in South Africa.
Wow, that's a lot. Maybe on a slightly more optimistic note, potentially you'll have to tell me. I want to talk a little bit about education specifically. Of course, we know that girls' education is a key, if not the key, to women's empowerment politically and economically later in life. And girls' education also intimately linked with economic performance. I don't know the numbers. Edith might know how much of that 1% to 2% it costs governments or nations that don't have as much opportunity for women comes from a lack of education as well. But you've been looking at the situation for girls' education in South Africa, and I wonder what some of the common barriers there still are, and what, if any, sort of innovative solutions you may have come across in your work.
Yeah. So again, in terms of policy, we have very progressive policies that allow girls to stay in school. And indeed, on the face of it, it would appear that girls are accessing education in larger numbers these days. However, if you look closely at the statistics, you realize that there's very high attrition rates, particularly in the latter part of high school, for both boys and girls. But if you look at the reasons for dropping out of school, you realize gender differences between girls and boys, with boys mainly stating cost as a barrier to schooling, and girls mainly citing unplanned pregnancies, child care, being withdrawn from school as barriers to their education. And so some of the interventions, I think, have to consider the I think the socio-cultural context in which girls learn and live, which, as I've said, produce this very gendered and very violent environment in which girls can access or cannot access education. And linked to that, the geographic location. We know for a fact that rural areas, for example, are more prone to gender-based violence that is linked to these sociocultural norms. And therefore, the interventions need to be necessarily gendered. They need to be necessarily context-specific in terms of geographic location, in terms of the sociocultural norms and values pertaining to particular communities. I could go on and on, but I think those are some of the examples I will mention at this point.
That's great, thanks. Let's shift to sort of practical market realm and bring you in here, Barrett, if we can. Barrett Ward with FashionABLE or FashionABLE? I'm not sure how to say it based on how it's spelled.
What are you feeling like today?
What am I? You know, I'm feeling
fashionable. We want it to be like Prince. We want it to be kind of mysterious, but we'll go with FashionABLE today.
Great, great. So you've been working for how many years now in Ethiopia?
4 years.
4 years. And among the motivating principles of your enterprise there is translating American purchasing power or Western purchasing power, but I think you're focused on an American market, into local economic empowerment for Ethiopian women. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, how well that works.
That's a good question. We got started in 2010. My wife and I were living in Ethiopia, and really what first attracted us to it is we were in the charity realm and saw that charity was critical for getting people off of their feet or off of the ground and onto their feet. But often where charity continued too far, we saw that economic opportunity should pick up. And we understand that socially, when a woman is given a job, I think it's well documented that when she is given a wage-earning job, it not only increases her own personal security, but it has an impact on her family and her community. So that became the motivating factor, and we're seeing impact. It is a social impact that has to be measured over time, and I think that it's important to look for organizations that are doing those kinds of audits. But yes, we're seeing great impact. A personal story is one of the first 3 women that we started with in working with our partner at Alilta Products there in Addis Ababa was living on the street and came into a rehabilitative charitable program, and then out of that was job trained to weave scarves. And her son Eob had been living on the street at that point in the beginning. Shoot, 5 years later, and she came into the office and showed Eob, her son, who's now 5 years old, or 6 years old, showed his report card and that he was ranking first in his class out of 44. So certainly there are anecdotal opportunities like that we get to measure our success, and then also on a more corporate level we have to look at the impact on a community.
Excuse me, maybe that ties in also to the other question I wanted to ask you. which is about the challenges that you face, or this idea of assistance through economic empowerment rather than charity, as you pointed out, faces when you try to scale up from sort of small scale or boutique enterprises into a larger or more major business. Presumably that would bring more opportunities to more women, but I imagine it's not quite that simple.
Correct. And there are a lot of boutique enterprises, and then they need to stay in that place, and they're sourcing from multiple places in Africa. But to have a large-scale impact, we need to have large-scale growth in manufacturing opportunities. One of the biggest things that we've seen, and I had a chance to recently lobby in Washington, D.C. on, was the Power Africa bill. That, to me, is one of the more exciting things happening in our own government, and really am promoting that and hoping that that comes to full bear. But the biggest impact that we've seen with something like that is when you just think of an assembly line within a manufacturing process. Certainly some things don't require energy or electricity, but some things do. And if you can imagine the burden that it places on, for example, a group that is having to heat water in order to dye fabric, that if for a day that they lost electricity in an unexpected time frame, because electricity goes out in unexpected times in Ethiopia, then you can imagine that the women are there being paid, and they still have to be paid, but they're not producing anything. And that equals a burden on the business from a cost perspective and then from an efficiency perspective, because the people on the other side of the coin that would be waiting for the dyed fabric are now having to wait longer than expected. So it does create inefficiencies when there's a lack of electricity. So I think that is one of the biggest things that we can do to bring these types of businesses into a larger scale impact.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. There's a sort of emerging theme in this conversation about the role of infrastructure, which we usually consider to be fairly mundane and boring, as having real dramatic power over the possibilities and opportunities that are afforded to women to get to work, as Ritu was mentioning, to get to school, to be able to have a job because there's enough power to power a job to go to. Edith, have you seen in this sort of policy sphere that people who work on infrastructure really see this as a gender issue?
I don't think they, I absolutely don't think they do. They should, but I don't think they do. And I'm glad we actually got to this, because this is another area that I think is extremely critical to any possibility of women being able to access economic opportunity equally. Again, because you have such infrastructure, and in particular electricity deficits in many parts of the developing world, you are further exacerbating the situation of women in these countries, because they always suffer much more than men do in these countries. So it's particularly important that we address this, you know, if we do want to see women progress in accessing economic opportunity. On the electricity, on Power Africa, I'm so glad this was mentioned, because this is one of the, you know, a really important piece of legislation that I think will be quite defining for a number of countries in Africa. And it's important, as we think about Power Africa, that we don't think about it as just big power. This is actually going to enable big power for businesses that support the jobs and those assembly lines, you know, that we were just talking about. As much as it will renewable energy, I mean, this is legislation that will empower U.S. businesses to invest in these African countries. And that supporting legislation is extremely critical. I think U.S. businesses need to have that comfort and knowledge that they will be given the support that's needed to encourage their participation in this untapped area. I mean, there's so much potential for electricity generation in Africa that's not even being touched. In my country, Nigeria, less than 25% of the population has access to electricity. I mean, it's ridiculous. And I've had personal experiences of being, even though I was a city girl, as I was called, of being in my village, because at the end of the day, you still come from a village, even if you're a city girl in Africa, of being in my village and being at the mercy of the lack of electricity when, you know, family members were sick, and being in very, very dire situations. You know, we've all seen it and read the stories of women in maternity wards where the electricity goes out, and when they need emergency interventions, they have to do this in the dark. You know, these are very, very important considerations that people don't always take into consideration when they think of infrastructure, but it's very much a gender issue. Similarly with security, girls are studying under street lights because they want to get an education. That means they're on the street, putting their lives at risk. And if they had electricity, they would be at home studying. But because a girl wants to go to school, her life is further endangered because she wants to make her life better. I mean, infrastructure is very much a woman's issue. And if we don't start paying attention to this and being supportive of the legislation that will help us address this, we will not tackle these issues. Yeah. So it's really important, and I'm glad we got here.
I agree with Edith wholeheartedly, and I think one of the conversations that needs to happen in terms of the Electrify Africa Act and Power Africa is, you know, who's going to get access to this power? Because when you look at the first country out of the gate on this program, when you look at the Ghana program that they are developing on Power Africa, there are some really concerning things about it. They are going to force Ghana to privatize that industry and open it to foreign competition. So, you know, that will drive a corporate model which is sustainable, but it won't necessarily get power to poor rural households because those households can't really pay for the electricity that they are being provided. They can't pay the full price for that. So it's not just should we power Africa, but how are we going to power Africa? Because powering factories, yes, that will provide jobs, but if the home doesn't have electricity, women are still going to go gather firewood, girls are still going to be studying under traffic lights. I mean, it is ridiculous, and I think one of the things that is critically important that Congress put into that bill is that the whole point of this exercise is to get power to the 75% of Nigerians that don't already have power, not to give more electricity to the 25% of Nigerians that already have access to it. So there are huge issues around equity in terms of this bill, and as everyone's been saying, if you have power, you have the possibility of getting out of poverty. If you don't, you don't. And so this question of who is going to get access to this power is really vitally important.
I see this linking up, and stick with me here because I promise it's going to happen, to the education issues that you brought up, Lebo. And I'm reminded as you guys are talking about a photographer, an American photographer named Peter DeCampo, who did a project some years ago called Life Without Lights. I don't know if you happened to see it. It was a bit of a deal in the photography community, and I'm sure it still lives online, Life Without Lights. And it depicts visually what you described, Edith, right? That rural reality, in this case in Ghana, where Peter DeCampo was a Peace Corps volunteer. And one of the points that he made when he was giving Summer another public presentation of his work was that you, from the other side, right, for those who don't have access to the institutional power system, to the grid, you have solar options, and you have all these sort of innovative, small-scale, kind of DIY power stopgaps. And while that's great in that people need power and that gives them access to power, it also, in a way, kind of dodges the question of just what are we asking a government to be accountable for and to whom. And that's how I actually see it linking back up to one of the education points you made, Lebo, about women's access, girls' access to education. That the sort of basic enrollment numbers are really rosy, and they've gotten a lot better over time. And of course, that's terrific. But when you look at attrition, the story is a little bit different. And I wonder, is there conversation about that in South Africa, about accountability at that next level? That when we talk about access, we're not just talking about that one entry point, but access over time that amounts to the receiving of an education you could carry with you forward and get those skills that you were telling us are so important to equalizing opportunity. Do you see a conversation going on about that, or not quite yet?
There is conversation going on, but for me, I think the conversation is only partial, and it's in terms of the analysis has been that the problem is either with the child is not very well prepared for schooling, and therefore we need to do something for the child or to the child mostly. Or the problem is really with the teachers. We need to develop teachers some more so that they are better knowledgeable about their subject, and they are better knowledgeable about the way how to teach. The conversation has so far mostly ignored the socio-cultural context that I was referring to earlier, or even the environmental issues that impact on education. So interventions are mostly academic, and I think interventions need to include more of the socio-cultural aspect and the environmental aspect. For example, rather than in addition to these academic interventions, I strongly believe that other conversations around health, for example, around sexual and reproductive health in particular, which is my area of interest, or simply around, well, how do we address safety issues within communities and within and around schools. So those are the conversations that are still missing for me.
I wonder, the three of you in particular work from really different perspectives, it strikes me, on some very broadly similar goals. And I'd be curious to hear what strategies you think might be beneficial or even more experimental, because why not at this point, in terms of widening that notion of government accountability, in terms of sitting people down so when we talk about a budget for roads, it's not, you know, some sort of stunning surprise when you say, and also this is a gender issue, and the likely male minister of finance across from you goes, whoa, 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 what? Like, how can we get governments to understand this or advocate around these things for women as well in a way that treats this holistically?
Well, let me share a couple of interesting things that we've done and that I've seen, and one is at a very sort of national government level, and the other is a very local level, because I think you can work this issue from the top down and the bottom up. And in terms of the top down, one of the things that Women Thrive did was got Congress to put in the legislation that created the Millennium Challenge Corporation requirements that women had to be consulted and gender had to be integrated into these projects. And what that eventually led to was that in each country that got support from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and we're talking about $500 million, $600 million of support, we're talking about huge amounts of money, that each country that got that had to have a senior gender advisor, director, on their staff, and that director had to sign off on every contract that came through. So what that meant was finally someone with gender expertise actually had some leverage and some power in this dynamic. And they could look at a contract for a road, for an electrical power plant, for whatever was coming through, and say, no, there's not enough gender here. You haven't really thought it through. You haven't figured out how this road is going to actually serve the needs of women efficiently, so I'm not signing off on this. And you don't get your money till you go back and you redesign this. Now, that's a hard thing to do for a woman, but many of the women who were the gender directors or advisors in these countries were really brave and really stuck to their guns and forced a lot of change to happen. So you can actually mandate it. You can mandate it and make it happen from the top down, and it can work. I won't say that it's easy on the people who have to be the enforcers of it, but it can be done. The other thing, at a very local level, I'm a very strong believer in supporting local democracy because, in countries like Sri Lanka or many countries where the national government is either too corrupt or too dysfunctional to engage, your only option is really to work at the local grassroots level, like Edith was talking about with the women in Togo. And one of the things that a group of women in Sri Lanka did after the tsunami was they formed an association and they said, look, we're not getting any of the services that we need. We've been relocated, but we don't have water, we don't have electricity, we don't have sanitation. So we're going to put together an agenda for our local elected officials. These are the things that we want. And they posted it on every road intersection in their village. So it was completely public. Everyone could see it. And they said to the candidates, whoever is going to do these things, all the women in this village will vote for you. So they got the candidates to promise to do it and elected one of the guys who agreed, who convinced them that he would do it all. But they didn't stop there. They actually staged sit-ins in his office to make sure that he actually did turn on the water supply, that he did deliver the electricity. And so women do have that power. One of the benefits of working on local democracy is that it's local, and that's where services are delivered, that's where education is delivered, that's where all these services come together. And it's easier, I think, to sometimes hold those local government officials accountable because they're not necessarily as tied into the overall power structures. And they also, they live close by. People may know them. They're part of their community. So those are just two examples of some ways I think you can begin to change the dynamics, whether it's top down or bottom up.
I'll mention a couple of ideas that are practical. One is data, related to data. I always say data is illuminating, and nothing moves leaders like saying things like the economic costs of discriminating against women. You'd be surprised, as much as we like to think we collect a lot of data in the World Bank, and we like to think that we're quite rigorous in our data collection, there's a lot of problems with the quality of the data because we are still relying on national household surveys, and so the quality of this data that we're collecting really varies. So that's an area where there's a lot of potential for some serious work there. And particularly the disaggregation of this data is what's going to get us to the kind of information that we want to see. That's how we'll assess progress. That's how we'll be able to tailor the interventions specifically to the needs of different countries and their situations. So I think data and the illuminating revelations from it is one area of focus that I would definitely promote. The other thing that I wanted to mention was just promoting women's involvement in cooperatives. When Ritu was talking about local democracy, I was thinking of the formal democracy.
Yes, exactly.
These cooperatives that women engage in, whether it's for accessing finance or just market cooperatives, these are really important opportunities for women to share ideas, be supportive mechanisms, just get educated on laws. So I think the more that we can support these cooperatives and women's capacity or ability to engage in those, I think the more we'll start to see some movement and some progress happening. And these are things that can be done while enabling laws are still being figured out. And these are very simple interventions that the international community can be supportive of. And then finally, I remembered an organization, the Zambia National Women's Lobby. Their strategy is to engage men. I think that's another important thing that we have to do. Nothing's going to change if men don't. I'm meeting with ministers of finance all the time, and they're mostly men. Okay, so they're not doing a thing different unless they're convinced to. They're not doing it because women say they should. They're doing it because it makes economic sense. So yes, there's the argument that can be made that it's the right thing to do, but I think we also have to get smart. And we have to start engaging men and building champions. And the example of the Zambia National Women's Lobby is a great one because they're building up a cadre of men who are becoming advocates for change.
I can add from the South African perspective, at least, I think that partnerships and lobbying together. The example I can think of is of the rural women's movement, which has successfully, at least for now, stopped a very archaic sort of bill which sought to introduce what is called the traditional courts, where rural villages are going to be under the rule of the chief rather than under the constitution of South Africa. So with the rural women's movement, together with bigger organizations such as Sonke Gender Justice, which is an organization that works with men, and the CGE, what does the CGE stand for? But Gender Equality, is a Chapter 9 institution in South Africa, came together to lobby government to successfully stop this bill. So I believe that partnerships can work better to help local small organizations to lobby on behalf of women in terms of policy making.
I want to bring Barrett back into here a little bit. We've been talking about this these issues from sort of political entry points, whether it's top down or bottom up. Barrett, your entry point into all of this is bottom up economics, I guess. And I wonder, as you listen to all of this, do you see this linking back to changes that come when the mother you described suddenly has opportunity? Do you see linkages between working women themselves and their local institutions of power, the way things function, their thoughts, their hopes for their next generation, for their daughters? What kind of change, if any, are you watching as you see these women take their jobs by the horns?
I want to answer that, and I also want to make one comment towards the subject before, and I appreciated the thought that we need to be intelligent about how we work with these interventions and how we educate ourselves. And I think it would be obvious to say that our host today, the One Campaign, with the Women and Girls Campaign, is doing incredible work in educating. And so I think that if people want to learn more, they have a resource right in front of them that's very accessible, that is not only wildly effective here in the United States with impact with government policy, but also is intimately involved in the continent of Africa in working with leaders of countries to affect that same change. So to your point, yes, we've seen that you know, these social broad comments that we understand about women's security and health and her children's care, that we have been able to see on a practical local level, and that has been a real gift for us. You know, the first partner we started with is named Alilta Products, and they have done a brilliant job of developing a women-led business. And so it's not only women weaving and dyeing and the more manufacturing level jobs, but we've seen women coming in at every level, from local sales director to the manufacturing operations director, all the way to administration and accounting. So we do see that when there is businesses created, people have to be hired, and the downward impact to the women's families and their communities is real.
Thanks. We're getting a question here on Twitter from Christy York Wooten. Ritu, she wants us to tell a little bit, if you can, about the work that you've done and the way that you understand women using faith as a component toward their own economic empowerment. Does this come up for you at all in the groups that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing to keep in mind is that most of the women in the world, and most of the women that we are talking about, are women of faith. You know, their religious lives and their economic lives are not two completely separate things. And you know, faith can be a mechanism for women to come together as a group, as a collective. It can also be a way for women to begin to engage the men in their community, particularly if they have a supportive imam or pastor or rabbi, that they can start these conversations around some of these very touchy socio-cultural norms and issues like that. And so one of the things that we've done is to work with a number of faith-based organizations that are interested in, say, taking on the issues of gender-based violence. And we help include them in a process of influencing the United States government, but also work with them to connect to local women's organizations so they can get the best of the local knowledge in terms of how to talk about gender-based violence, how to engage communities around that issue, and how they can begin to be a real positive force rather than a negative force for women's empowerment. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I agree.
No, this is great. I wonder, as you think about, we're coming up sort of toward the end of 2014, we're coming up on 2015, what's going to happen with the Millennium Development Goals is, of course, on everyone's mind. There's a lot of advocacy around making a goal in whatever new version of these MDGs that we end up with, specifically devoted to women and in some variation, in some language, in empowerment. What do you expect are going to be the next big issues that we deal with in this very large sort of issue area? What are we going to be talking about in the weeks and months ahead, especially as we discuss in more depth and with more urgency the MDG?
Well, I think we're now at the stage where it's become a political process, and while I don't believe that the opportunities for us to advocate and shape the outcomes are gone, I think they are reduced. So we should keep that in mind. But that does present an opportunity for grassroots efforts, because now it's in the hands of the governments who will negotiate the final outcome, and they will be influenced by their people. So I think the more we can link up with local folks, local entities, people working at a grassroots level who can be engaged better in this conversation, then the more successful that outcome will be. And I think that's what the next year really needs to focus on. That wasn't done with the original MDGs. In my country, people did not know what the MDGs were until maybe 5-7 years ago. And it's still not popularly socialized in the global south. So I think that there's an opportunity now to really focus on making sure the new development agenda is globally recognized and that people feel that they have a stake in it. And the way you build stake is to engage them early on in the process, so that when they see goals that they recognize, that then they can, that they understand that their influence actually realized the definition of a process to tackle their challenges. So I think that for the next 1 year should be a really critical area that all of us are supportive of and helping to promote.
Anyone else want to weigh in there? You said it all, Edith. You said it all.
Saying that on data, just to emphasize, sorry, I'm a bit of a data fiend. I think the next year is another opportunity for us to really drive. One thing is a focus on the goals. Another is how the goals are actually going to be implemented, right? We will not implement the goals effectively if we don't have good data to monitor progress and, again, make sure that we're tailoring our interventions where they need to go. So we have to make sure that in next year, or even beyond, however long it takes, we start to improve the quality of the data that we're getting at. What we have today, and this scares me, what we have available today will not allow us to adequately measure the success of any interventions that we make. I think that's actually really scary to me, because I know that I want to see changes in my country, and if the data coming out of my country today will not allow us to adequately measure any progress or tell a story on what the interventions are doing, then nothing's going to change. So this is a critical, really critical issue.
It is critical, and again, it is also a political issue that there's a safety for governments in not being able to measure things, in not having to know, in not having to measure. So it's not just that everybody is on board with, yeah, let's get more data. There's a lot of resistance to collecting data, not to mention that it is quite expensive. One other thing I'll mention in terms of 2015 that I think Nebu can also talk about is that we're trying to shift the conversation in terms of being careful what targets we set in the context of the MDGs. Last time we set a target on closing the gap between boys and girls in primary school and also having universal enrollment in primary school. And what that did is it put hundreds and thousands of kids into classrooms that were too small, or into classes that then became too big, or their name was on the registration roll but they never showed up in school. So, in essence, it was a noble goal to set, but it was the wrong target. And I think one of the things Women Thrive is working closely with Brookings Institution on is shifting the focus away from enrollment to learning and achievement. Not even completion, but into what are kids actually learning in school? Are they getting the skills that are going to equip them to participate in the economy of the future? And you probably have a lot more to say about that.
Yeah. I think you've covered the essence of what needs to happen, and linked to that would then be how do we provide this learning, and at least in the context of South Africa, addressing the inequalities between schools. Now, at a guess, I would say about 3% at the most of South African children receive quality education just because of where they are located, and just because of the schools they go to. The majority of the children go to really, really poor schools where quality learning is an impossibility. So measuring how governments are addressing those inequalities should also come into the picture.
And lest we think that we are talking only about some small slice of the world that needs slightly more attention than the quote-unquote rest of the world, South Africa, being in Africa, also a middle-income country, sort of straddles our imaginative perceptions. But what you've described, Lebo, is exactly true of where I grew up in the United States. It's true of a lot of states and districts in the United States in terms of educational opportunity. These are universal issues that are being wrestled with by grassroots groups around the world, and that governments, both more empowered and less empowered in the global system, also need to be held accountable for. So we're really talking about something that's a really big picture here. We're closing in on the end of our time. Does anyone have final thoughts they want to share, or favorite ideas that they didn't have an opportunity to discuss, or anything we missed?
I think in the spirit of bringing in men, I think Barrett should have the last word.
Oh my goodness. Well, I can say this. The thing that I think about the whole time that I'm in a call like this is I'm so grateful for women like the three of you. I can't tell if you can tell I'm pointing at the three of you all. And just the amount of, as you have said, intelligence and strategy that is brought to this front, I'm just so grateful for. I feel like as a business owner that what I get to do is play in the playground that you all are setting up through infrastructure, through the lobbying of one, and the strategy that you all set aside or set forth as women, and those ideas of approaching leaders like you were saying, and creating ambassadors. I just sit in awe and am grateful for the fact that there's people like you that are in leading the charge. So thank you.
On that lovely, cheerful note, thank you all for your time. Thanks those who participated, listening, who shared ideas and thoughts on Twitter. We were here today with the One campaign and with Women Thrive, hosted by Google, to talk about women's economic empowerment and teaching women to fish, and so much more as we came to learn in this hour. So thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.